Good afternoon, postgraduates and students from across our country. I'm Dr. Raj Shekharan, Chairman of the Department of Orthopedics and Spine Surgery, Ganga Hospital, and also the past President of Indian Orthopedic Association. I have with me my colleague, Senior Spine Consultant, Dr. Ajay Prasad Shetty from Ganga Hospital, also to be the co-faculty over here. And I'm so glad that all of you are here to participate in the second webinar of the PACE PG Academy for Continuous Excellence 2020, which is conducted by the Indian Orthopedic Association in collaboration with the Janssen India and Insignia Learning. I'm sure that this is a good endeavor which will help you to connect to the best of the faculty from all over the country, from in fact across the world too, because I think the OTA USA also is going to be a part of the future webinars. So today we will be talking about a very, very important topic, and he will talk to you on post-operative infections.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you, sir. And I will be speaking upon post-operative spinal infections. Surgical site infections occurs in about 2 to 5% of the patients undergoing surgery. It is the most common and costly hospital-acquired infections. Why it is much more important is because up to 60 to 70% are preventable. The effort at preventing surgical site infection started way back in the early 19th century when carbolic acid was used, and it was popularized later by Joseph Lister. The era of antibiotics, which started in 1928, made us believe that probably the infection is a thing of the past. William Stewart, US Surgeon General in 1967 said, probably it's time to close the book on infections. But however, the post-operative infections remain the major cause of preventable mortality and morbidity in the world today. My plan of the talk would be to give an introduction and on preventive aspects of post-operative infections, then on post-operative discitis and a post-implant infection in the spine. Post-operative infection is defined as an infection that occurs after surgery in the part of the body where the surgery has taken place. It can be classified as superficial, deep, and organ space infection. This is a CDC criteria, and everybody should understand that it can be a superficial surgical site infection. That means the one which affects the skin and subcutaneous tissue. We know that it is simple to treat, and it heals without any major consequences. On the other hand, if it goes down to the fascia and muscle, it is called the deep incisional surgical site infection. And if it goes down to the organ space, that is the bone, that is the vertebra and the disc space, it's called the organ space surgical site infection. It's important for us to differentiate between these three. As I mentioned, superficial incisional surgical site infection heals without a sequelae, whereas a deep incisional and especially organ space surgical site infection will alter the course of our management and will affect the overall outcome of the particular patients. Therefore, the wound contamination usually occurs in the time interval between the incision and closure. Therefore, there are two categories of flora. The resident flora, that is the organisms that are normally present in an individual, live in harmony with the host, and usually provide some benefit of protection. Whereas a transient flora are microorganisms which are picked up from the environment. Therefore, both these things are important. The resident flora, you have to aim to prevent the resident flora from contaminating the wound which you have made, number one. Number two, the transient flora, that is the flora that is in the environment of the operation theater, either from the surgeon, from the nurse, or in the environment of the operation theater to contaminate the wound. And this is how we should aim to prevent the post-operative surgical site infections. It's important because it's expensive. It increases the stay of the hospital. And also, most importantly, the mortality and morbidity is significantly higher. And more so, if somebody has got a drug resistant, the infection, the chances of death also significantly increases. What about the incidence of drug resistance of the post-operative infections in India? Unfortunately, we don't have exact statistics. There was one study which was done by the INICC, that is the Developing Nations Consortium, And they looked at hip and knee prosthesis at about 7 to 8 centers throughout India. And they found the infection rate was about 2%. Is it less? It is similar to what is reported in other developing nations. But when you compare it to developing nations, that's what reported by the CDC, our infection rates was much higher. Why we should be concerned about it? Because the growing number of organisms, infections that is happening is because of bacterial resistance. There is no new antibiotics in the pipeline, and these resistant bacteria are basically community-acquired infections. And this has been one of the factors that has been attributed is to use of poultry, not only in India, in worldwide, use of antibiotics in the poultry industry, and even in veterinary medicine. This causes a local resistance which spread in the community, causing a fixation of resistance and a community resistance. The incidence of postoperative infection, the global incidence is about 0.7 to 16%. The instrumentation, it is much lesser in instrumented surgery. That is, instrumented surgery is higher, that is 3 to 6%. Whereas in the uninstrumented surgery, it is usually less than 1%. When you do a posterior surgery, that's the approach from the back, the incidence is much higher when compared to the anterior. What are the common organisms? Commonly, if you see the literature, the most common organisms are the gram-positive organism, most commonest. It could be Staph epidermidis. But when you go lower down to the lumbosacral area, the gram-negatives are more common, if you look at the literature. But however, there is a changing trend. And also the infection rates increases as per the magnitude of the surgery goes. And also the ASA, the anesthesia category, the significance, as it moves to anesthetic ASA category 2 and 3, the infection rate significantly increases. And now recent studies have shown that minimally invasive surgery, the infection rates are significantly much lesser when compared to the open surgery. It's quite understandable because you are not exposing the whole wound to the exterior. Therefore, the exogenous factors are significantly less. The muscle trauma is less. Therefore, the endogenous factors are significantly lesser. Then how do you categorize these groups? One is patient-related factors, surgeon-related factors, and the surgery-related factors. Patient-related factors, the most important one are the age, elderly individuals, ASA score. The higher the score, higher the chance of infection. Obese, uncontrolled diabetes, smoking, they've got higher chances of infections. Also, patients with chronic skin conditions like psoriasis, when there is a decrease in competency, the nutrition status is poor, definitely that increases the infections. Along with other factors like you are redoing surgery, previous infections, you're not following protocols, then the chance of infection becomes higher. These are patient-related factors. What about surgery-related factors? Any surgery where the duration of surgery is longer, more than 3 to 4 hours, number one. Therefore, when the duration of surgery increases, the need for blood transfusion increases. Therefore, when you're instrumenting, again, there are multiple factors. One is the duration of surgery, the need for blood, everything becomes increasingly higher. The surgeon-related factors are something that are very easily preventable. That is a breach in the sterile technique. It could be in the operation theater. It could be outside the operation theater in the form of sterilization, draping, room traffic, contaminated instruments. And when you're using fluoroscopy, microscopy, it's important that you maintain the sterility. Therefore, you would have seen in the operation theaters, the sisters are very particular that you do not contaminating the operating field. And that's very, very important factor in prevention of infections. Coming to the next point, how to prevent postoperative infections. You've got non-modifiable risk factors. Age, obesity, diagnosis, and the type of procedure is non-modifiable. If somebody has got a fractured neck or femur, you have to do a bipolar or a replacement, you have to do it. Similarly, these factors are non-modifiable. Modifiable factors, what we should target is the nutrition status, diabetic control, smoking cessation, anemia, and the timing of antibiotics. Timing of antibiotics is very, very important. It has been shown that you should give an antibiotic, a prophylactic antibiotic should be given within half an hour of your surgical incision, or at the most up to 1 hour. It should not be given in the ward and then the patient shifted to the operation theater. We did a study and we looked at preventive care bundles and their impact on surgical site infections. As you can see in this picture, the infection rates dramatically reduced over a period of time and currently it's about 0.6%. And what does this bundle means? Is only bundle means there is a care bundle. So you're grouping together multiple factors which are known to be effective in preventing infections. One is a preoperative bundle. Second is an intraoperative bundle. Third is a postoperative bundle. What is a preoperative bundles? Optimization. Optimize the patient. Optimize the blood sugar. Look for other sites of infections. Be sure that there is no other infection. The patient is optimized in terms of general condition, sugar control, and that makes it much. And whenever it's possible, if the surgery can be delayed, you can reduce the body weight. Post-admission, it's again a pre-bundle. You control the glycemic, and we practice and we advocate the use of chlorhexidine bath, which has to be done at least 2 times the day before surgery and the day during the morning of surgery. Intraoperative measures is again the similar measures which are bundled together: skin antisepsis, surgical hand antisepsis, use of chlorhexidine-based scrubs, and most importantly, accurate timing of giving of antibiotic prophylaxis. And this is the antibiotic protocol. In uninstrumented, it's usually 24 hours, whereas instrumented, it can be given for 1 day, but in our practice, depending on the magnitude of surgery, we may extend it up to 24 hours or up till the drain removal. With all this, if you look at the literature, as I mentioned earlier, the commonest organism is gram-positive, the Staph aureus, so-called the prince of pathogens. But in the Indian scenario, at least in our practice, and also it has been reported in other Indian scenarios, the most commonest organisms are gram-negative organisms. We don't know why. There is a higher incidence of gram-negative organisms as a post-operative source of infection. In majority of the centers in India, there are some centers still reports gram-positive organisms incidence being lesser. Therefore, it's important that when you look at prevention, the modifiable risk factors. Okay, for example, any remote site of infections, poor oral health, diabetes, smoking, malnutrition, anemia, all these factors, if you control, most importantly, pre-op antibiotics, glycemic control, scrubbing, and sterile techniques, the chances that you will become better, prevention of infection are significantly higher. We understand that prevention is better than cure, and that's what we should aim for. And in our practice right now, our infection rates is usually less than 0.5%. And it's important that it's the surgeon's main responsibility is to prevent the chances of postoperative infection. And usually it's a big relief for you and as well to the patient if he doesn't have one. Coming to the next part of the talk is postoperative discitis. The incidence is less than 1%. It could be superficial, deep, and discitis. You see, this is a degenerated disc. The disc appears black in the MRI. Normally, it should look whiter. But in a discitis, you can make out the whole thing is destroyed along with the disc and the adjacent vent plate. Therefore, it could be a superficial infection. How do you say it's superficial? Usually, whenever there's an infection of the disc or vertebra, especially in a patient in a postoperative scenario, they come with a significant back pain. In this scenario, the patient just walks in. There is no spasm. SLR is negative. And usually, this heals by just dressing or sometimes secondary suturing. Whereas a deep infection, you need some sort of investigation to confirm, either in the form of an ultrasound or MRI. It is going up to the dura, but is not affected the vertebra or the disc. It needs a debridement and suturing. Whereas a postoperative discitis is the one which worries us all, because we presume and the patient presumes that the surgery is simple and he should be all right. And if he develops a postoperative discitis, the course is altered and it will have a significant impact on the patient's recovery to normalcy. Therefore, the classical thing is there's an asymptomatic period after surgery. Therefore, patient presents with a back pain, and clinically, when you look at the wound is healed. Usually, the patient presents about 2 to 4 weeks following the surgery. He was fine for the first 2 to 3 weeks. Significant back pain, that is the most important. They don't come with pressure, fever. They come with the back pain. Therefore, the classical thing is the back pain, which is disproportionate to the physical findings. Patient is not able to turn in the bed. He comes in a stretcher. Even when he is walking, he keeps his back held very tight. And that is the characteristic feature. And this, if the patient has had a period of normalcy between the surgery for 2 or 3 weeks, is always very classically indicative of a discitis. And literature shows that 80% of them present within the first 4 weeks. And as you know, ESR is not that useful because ESR rises in the first 5 days and then it takes 3 to 4 weeks for it to come back to normalcy. It will remain higher for a longer duration of time. CRP is much more better because usually it drops down to a normal level by about day 5. And if you have a secondary peak, if there is a secondary peak of ESR, CRP, that indicates that this patient has probably got an infection in the spine. We in trauma usually or in other scenario, procalcitonin is used significantly, but in spine, procalcitonin does not have a significant role in the diagnosis of postoperative infections. What is important also is a lymphocyte count, which is less than 1,000 per unit liter at 4 days postoperatively. And also the ratio between the neutrophil and the lymphocyte count is also useful. It gives an idea. In early discitis, patient comes around 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, comes with a significant back pain. The back is very stiff. Turning in bed is difficult. Wound has healed well. X-rays usually look normal. Therefore, a high index of suspicion, and there should be a low threshold to get an MRI scan done in these patients who are apparently normal, who are normal for the first 2 or 3 weeks following surgery, and then develop symptoms. You have to suspect discitis. This is a patient with early discitis, but the difference is that you are seeing collection here. These are abscesses. And presence of an abscess, especially in the canal, from a pyogenic source, is usually an indication for surgery. In the early phase, the bone changes are very less. But whereas in the later phases, you can see the bones destruction is more, it collapses, there is sclerosis, and you should not wait till that point to diagnose. If you wait later, the deformity is more, you need to stabilize, you need to instrument, you need to operate on the patients. This is a sequence of MRI changes in a patient with a postoperative discitis. I mean, as postgraduates, you would have heard about the use of bone scan in infection scenario. But overall, in infection scenario, even in orthopedic or appendicular bone infections, the use of bone scan has significantly come down, mainly because of the MRI is able to pick up infections very fast. Yes, in spine, it's of no use. When people have studied multimodality imaging in the diagnosis of postoperative infections, they use MRI, they use PET-CT, and they use PET CT scan. And they found that the PET-CT scan offers a very slight advantage over MRI because it has got higher specificity and it provides a whole body examination. But majority of the time, MRI is adequate for us to diagnose infections. Therefore, once you are diagnosed it, once you are diagnosed with discitis, what to do for this patient, whether you just give antibiotics arbitrarily and send them home, or whether we need to do biopsy and give antibiotics, whether we need to debride, whether we need to fix it. The rule of the game is very easy. Always take a blood culture because conservative treatment gives good results, especially in the early phases, provided you are able to get a source, that is, provided you are able to identify the bacteria and give appropriate antibiotics for an adequate duration of time. Therefore, always take a blood culture because studies have shown, especially in certain scenarios, like you might be culture positivity in the blood culture could be as high as 50 to 60%. Therefore, any patient who comes with a suspected infection, it's always better to take a blood culture first. Patient is on antibiotics, it may be not of use. That is one of the problems in the Indian scenario where patients are arbitrarily put on oral antibiotics. But it's always better if not take cultures. It could be CT guided, fluoroscope guided, open or endoscopic culture. The culture positivity rate may vary. If you get a culture positivity, it's very easy. But in the patient who had antibiotics, it's always better to do an extended culture. Usually the culture they may report at 2 days. You may ask them to have an extended culture for 5 days to 7 days. And studies have shown that the extended culture, the positivity rate increases. Next, the question is what antibiotic to give and how long to give. Okay, antibiotic, if you have a culture sensitivity pattern, is very easy. Earlier, we used to give for IV for 4 weeks and oral for 8 weeks. But currently, the protocol has changed worldwide. It's 2 weeks of IV antibiotics and oral antibiotics for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. And this is based on a prospective randomized trial done in France. And they have shown a 10-year follow-up with a good outcome of 2 weeks of IV antibiotics and around 4 weeks of oral antibiotics. This is one of the studies which have been published last year. They said that the oral antibiotics is equivalent to IV antibiotics. And 6 weeks of antibiotics therapy is adequate. It's basically because the current generation of antibiotics and the technology has made the bioavailability of the antibiotics either by oral and IV route to almost the same. But however, if there is a Staph aureus bacteremia, gram-negative bacteremia, and it's important that you may have to have an extended duration. See, this is an example of a conservative treatment of a postoperative discitis with a good outcome, who had a culture positivity in the blood culture. Okay, one more example. Patient was conservative treated, but sometimes it can collapse. But however, the end result is good with slight loss of lordosis, but a good functional outcome. Therefore, to summarize, uninstrumented, superficial and deep. Superficial, you can diagnose by patient comfortable, normal walking, wound and no spasm. Deep, walks with a stiff back, severe back pain and limitation of movement. Usually you can heal by dressing or secondary suturing. On the other hand, deep wound infection like a discitis, always do a blood culture, urine culture, CRP and ESR. Early 3 to 4 weeks, you can manage the culture positivity by antibiotics alone. If you don't get a culture, you may have to debride and give antibiotics. They usually heal well. When they present late, this is an example of an only debridement group with a good functional outcome. When you debride, the major advantage, either by endoscopic or by open method, the pain is significantly less. Basically, when you debride, you are decompressing the disc space and the pain dramatically drops. And that's one of the major advantages. A patient is suddenly relieved of pain and he believes you and he thinks that, okay, with your treatment, he's going to become better. And if it's deep and late, we need to do an instrumented fusion. Because whenever there is a failure of conservative treatment, whenever you are not able to identify the organism, whenever the patient presents with a neurological deficit, or whenever there's a significant instability, it's important that we need to stabilize them. In the lumbar spine, you can approach, as Dr. Rajshekharan showed that in the tuberculosis earlier, you can approach it from behind. You can just doing a post TLIF or a PLIF from behind, and you can get a good results out of it. But the most important thing is that you have to debride it well so that it gives you a good amount of fusion without any major consequences. The current trend, if you are diagnosing them very early before there is a significant bone destruction, what you can do is just do a percutaneous fixation to stabilize and give antibiotics based on the culture reports. And this has been shown that it gives a good relief, provided you diagnose them much earlier before there is a amount of bone destruction. The idea of percutaneous fixation is only for pain relief, which will be there for the first 2 or 3 months. Therefore, the important point is high index of suspicion, take a tissue culture, and the operative intention is based upon the destruction of the bone. The last part of the talk is infection following posterior instrumentation. There could be 5 types. It could be suprafacial. There could be wound dehiscence, pus around the implant, bone marrow edema, the pus in the disc space. I'm just going to give you the general principles. It's always important to identify that the patient has got an infection. You get in, debride, evacuate the gross purulent material in the dead muscle, debride from superficial to deep, be aggressive, irrigate. At the end of the irrigation, relook, be sure you have not left any dead muscles inside. If there is doubt, debride more aggressive. If there is an early infection, it's always better to retain the implants, give good antibiotics. And if you are able to close the soft tissue, it's better to do a primary or a delayed closure. But if you're not able to close the soft tissue, it's better to use a VAC. Implants, titanium is any day better because the chance of infection is very less. VAC is one of the things, vacuum assisted closure is one of the things you should know. It could be a short notes question. The important thing is when to use VAC. Whenever there is a deep subfacial infection, if the infection is above the fascia, you need not use a valve. When the infection is deep subfacial, whenever there is a muscle necrosis, you need to exercise a lot of muscle so that you find that you are creating a dead space inside. Whenever there's an implant infection, you may need to use a VAC. And don't hesitate, because the problem is most of the time we debride, and then try to get in VAC at a later stage. It's important that you use VAC in the earlier stage of your infection itself. It provides a temporary soft tissue coverage with the reduction of the dead space. And you can do a delayed primary closure of the wound. The whole idea is to provide a soft tissue coverage and reduce the dead space. That is the most important. Therefore, this is what the vac does. Basically, when the vacuum is there, it reduces the edema, it sucks off all the fluids, removes the cytokines, increases the blood flow and the oxygen tension, and it tends to cause shrinkage of the wound and a gradual closure of the wound. As you can see in one of our patients who has been operated, you see the figure A, it looks so bad, but as the days advances, the wound looks better and better, and eventually we are able to do a secondary suturing with a good outcome, with no recurrence of infection, even at 2 years follow. It's not adequate enough if you just remove the implant alone. As you can see, once we remove the implant, it can heal. But you can see over here, it heals with collapse, it heals with scoliosis, it heals with kyphosis. Therefore, the patient will have a significant pain at long-term outcome. Therefore, what are the implant strategy we are looking at? If the purchase is good, retain the implant. If purchase is poor or doubtful, revise or extend your fixations. Cage, if it's good in the early phase, you can retain. If it is loose, you can revise it, remove it, or sometimes just compress or put a graft inside. Okay, implant does not compromising the healing. What is important for an infection to settle is a good stability. Okay, that is the most important thing. If it doesn't have a stable spine, your infection will take a longer time to settle down, and the patient will have a significant amount of discomfort. Let's see this example, a patient who was operated with the infection. We had to revise, but the most important thing, when we revise, we extend our fixation proximally and distally. We put a re-cage again, bigger size cage. But what is important is that you have to debride. You see the whole of the disc has come out as single piece when we are debriding. Therefore, a good debridement is the key, along with a good stabilization. And thirdly, an antibiotic which is adequate and covered for a good duration of time. If they present late, it's better to remove the implant, but you may have to consider the option of reimplantation, especially in deformity surgery. How long to give antibiotics in this scenario? The current consensus is about 12 weeks of antibiotic therapy. As I mentioned, you can give a short course of 2 weeks of IV, but then followed by oral antibiotics. These are few examples where we have done debridement and we have done a screw revision. Second example where we have done a debridement and only revised the cage because the screw purchase was good. Third example where there was a lot of infection and there are a lot of muscle necrosis. Therefore, what we needed to do is to leave it open, use vac, and you can see how the wound shrinks over a period of time, and we were able to do a secondary closure with no recurrence of infection. A very rare scenario when you have an infection which is present in the muscle significantly, and one of the options is to use an antibiotic beads. It's not as commonly used as antibiotic beads as used in infective non-union in the extremities, but still we have used it. It's not a commonly used procedure in situations, especially when there is a lot of muscle infection. I prefer to use this antibiotic beads, and then you go in again after a few weeks' time, remove the antibiotics weeks, debride, and then complete your procedure. To conclude, postoperative infection is better prevented than treated. It's important to do and have an early diagnosis and a high index of suspicion. And prevention is relatively easier in the fact sense it's a surgeon's discipline that matters. Because if you are concerned about the infection, you will take care of the patient pre-operatively, you take care of the patient intraoperatively and post-operatively, following the protocols, giving antibiotics, especially very important. Giving antibiotics within half an hour to 1 hour of the surgery is much more important. When you diagnose them, don't hesitate to be aggressive. Debride them as early as possible, and usually it leads to a satisfactory outcome. You can salvage the scenario. But if the patient is established, has got an established infection, achieving stability is important, and giving appropriate antibiotics for an adequate duration of time. Thank you very much.